Thank you for joining us today. My name is Diana Harris, and I'm the lead for operations here at ARACY. We're meeting today on the sovereign lands of Aboriginal people, lands that were never ceded. We acknowledge the traditional custodians and their enduring connection to the lands, waters, and skies. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present, and I extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. In solidarity, ARACY supports the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the need for truth-telling about the history and impact of colonisation. We treasure the rich and diverse cultures and customs of First Nations people, valued knowledge holders, leaders and partners in creating the conditions for all our children to thrive. Please feel free to acknowledge the country where you are in the chat. We love to see where everyone is joining us from. Today we are talking about the Early Years Catalyst, and thank you for coming along to hear about this. The Early Years Catalyst came out of the 2020 National Early Years Summit. Now, if you happen to be at the summit, you will know that the participants there developed a shared vision, which was that by 2030, significantly more children would be thriving in their first 2,000 days and beyond. To help us achieve that vision, a group of 12 founding members came together to help us undertake the work together, the spark that came out of the summit, to tend that and grow into something else, something more. We searched for philanthropic funding to take that work forward together, and I'd like to start by thanking the funders who made the Early Years Catalyst possible. The BHP Foundation, Alan and Jill Gray Philanthropies, the Australian Community Foundation, the Permsoo Foundation, and the Graf Family Foundation. I'd also like to thank the leadership table that guided and supported the work of the Catalyst as we went on this journey together. Now, we know that for optimal child wellbeing, we need to look holistically at a child's life. So the work of the Early Years Catalyst used ARACY's child wellbeing framework, the NEST, to guide and structure our thinking. To think about the child's needs, the needs of the parents and the carers, and the shared and joint needs, because we know that kids do well when their families do well. Now, it was very clear from the Early Years Summit that there was no shortage of passion, commitment, or brain power going into this work. But what we did need together was more shared understanding of how all the different parts connected and how we could work together more effectively. The founding members saw a role for a field catalyst to coordinate and amplify our efforts. And our goal was to take that systems level approach to fill some of the gaps that we saw that emerged from the summit and the work that all the partners had been doing, and to identify and activate the different actors who are all working for similar outcomes. So to tell you about how we went around doing that, I'd like to introduce two of my colleagues from the Early Years Catalyst, Emma Sydenham and Dan Leach-McGill. Emma is Director of Early Childhood at Social Ventures Australia, and Dan is Research and Evaluation Manager at the Front Project, who, along with SVA and ARACY, form the ongoing core of the Catalyst. Dan and Emma, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. So my name's Dan Leach-McGill, and I have the pleasure of working with Emma to just take you through some of the stages of the Early Years Catalyst. I joined the Front Project at around the time that a lot of the work was being consolidated into a lot of the work that had occurred over time was being consolidated, and that drew on a really rich body of work, which meant I got to dive in deep and have a look at some of the amazing work that had been produced through the Early Years Catalyst. So I'm going to do a bit of a speed tour through some of the work that's occurred, and then I'm going to hand over to Emma, who's going to talk about the areas of action. The Early Years Catalyst work went through a range of stages, starting with a system mapping process where major systems were mapped, and it was informed by more than 300 people from a range of backgrounds and areas of interest. alongside a rapid review of published perspectives on what's needed to shift outcomes for Australia's children. There were 3 pieces of work that came from the systems review, and they've really focused on the mapping, focused on what the current state is, that is how things are and how things are structured, and the thinking that underlies that, with a focus on identifying what the future state should be. This was built on with the Systems Landscape Atlas, which focused on the 10 key systems, or identified 10 key systems that interface with children's early development. The purpose of that work was to identify the structures that would enable and hold children and families' development. And there were a range of publications that came from this, which really gave a solid overview of those systems and how they interact around families' lives. The next piece of work was mental models work, and that sought to better understand the sort of deeply held societal beliefs and the assumptions underlying Australia's early years systems. That was conducted by the Telethon's Kids Institute and informed by, again, a range of diverse stakeholders to really draw out some of the deep thinking that underlies the way we act for children and families in Australia. The next piece of work brought together a range of evidence. So looking at the points of the system that are best placed to create change, and that analysed a range of transformational and areas where there's strong evidence to support transformation, and located those in a range of those systems, but also identified a range of leverage points that, if effectively used, could really move things along and generate some substantial change. This, again, was informed by a range of perspectives. It used published research, First Nations wisdom, and ways of knowing and experience. It drew on frontline practitioners and also families to bring the voices of families into the room, and looked at ways that change could be supported. Again, there were a range of publications that really spell out and dive deep into those. So as mentioned earlier, this is really a speed tour of these outputs that doesn't really do justice to the depth of work. But just to sort of look at some of the ways that we're able to use this work and this evidence that had been built through the Early Years Catalyst, was to think about ways that we could both project and plan using the framework as a tool. So the work has enabled us to really look at both areas where change could occur and then map that on the depth of change. So really reflect on where that exists in the system, look at where that is maybe a faster activity, a quicker win, or a longer term initiative. The other things that we've been able to do with the work is use it to really reflect and analyse different initiatives as they're being introduced. For example, we've used the framework that has stemmed from the Early Years Catalyst work to really look at the areas of strength and alignment of the early years strategy alongside the findings of the evidence base that's been built. So I'm going to pass to Emma now, who's going to talk us through some of the areas of action.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. And hello, everyone. It's great to be having this conversation with you. That's an enormous amount of work that Dan has just sped through in a very few minutes. So I hope in the chat, maybe someone can put the EYC, Early Years Catalyst website, and direct people to have a look at that bulk of work, but also a couple of the synthesis pieces that we've developed out of it. One is sort of a synthesis of all of that, and one is a very short 10-page sort of journey brief to run you through it. So really recommend you jumping into those. So Dan's looked at sort of what the Early Years Catalyst did. My next job is to look at the so what. What are the insights and the implications of the work, and how do they shine a light on where we need more focus, where we need a different focus, and how we go about that? So we had a bit of a sense-making process with the leadership about what the work was telling us, and really identified several key areas of focus for change that were really clear through the work. And these pretty neatly fit into the 4 clusters in the Evidence for Action report that Dan spoke to, around communities and families in the driver's seat, reimagining the service system, shared accountability for children's outcomes, and shifting society's perspectives. So I'll just run through those 4 and just share a couple of sort of highlights out of each to give you a flavour of where the work is really encouraging us to go. So the first one, communities and families in the driver's seat. At the heart, this is about how do we create significant shifts in power so that families and communities are participating in decisions about the systems that impact their lives. A couple of the key leverage points for this to really drive it forward. And we also looked in terms of what are the current opportunities in the landscape and how can we build on some of those opportunities. And that certainly comes through here. The 2 examples in this area really are, one is activating the voice of children and families. We've seen this a lot recently really come to the fore, but looking at it not just in a tokenistic way, but really how do we push the dial on this so that these voices are really genuinely informing and influencing decisions that are made about developing, implementing policy, services and programs. So strengthening that influence. The second is around place-based approaches as a really key vehicle to empower communities at a local level. We've really got unprecedented opportunity, I think, in this space at the moment, with opportunities like the Investment Dialogue for Australia's Children, the whole of government framework around redressing deep disadvantage in communities, to really look at how we shift the way that government structures interact with communities in a way that shifts those power dynamics and really centres in on that, and learning from the place-based work that's happening across the country at the moment and making sure that's feeding back into the system to learn from that. The second area was about reimagining the service system so that it is designed to respond to and meet children and family needs. And some of the key areas that were picked up as focus points in this were, one, an expanded universal system so that families do have access to the range of services and supports that they need to thrive. So really looking at how we do that. We've got opportunities at the moment, big opportunities with the early childhood education and care reform, but really, and others, looking at how do we build on that for more of an early childhood development system, really looking at overcoming the fragmentation and siloed approaches, really going where families are and making sure we're able to wrap around the different supports that they need. Another really big one here, of course, is redesigning the child protection or child wellbeing, a proactive child wellbeing system. And there it was interesting, the focus was looked at, well, what's the timing for leverage points? And really in this one, making sure that we have the preconditions for success in place. So how do we sort of reinforce and really rally around some things like a strong workforce, child and family voices being at the centre, accountability to children's outcomes, and shifting some mental models which currently drive the current system before we start that redesign, so we make sure that the redesign is really effective in achieving its goals. The third area is around shared accountability for children's outcomes. And there it's really around how do we ensure that all system actors are accountable for their contributions to progressing outcomes for children and families and seeing children and families thrive. It's been great to see accountability really emerge as a really strong theme across a number of movements in this space in recent years and converging around that and building momentum. Got some examples with the National Children's Commissioner and the work that she's leading around Act for Kids sort of campaign. But some of the focus areas here are really looking at what are the effective mechanisms to facilitate oversight and accountability, and how do we make good choices about those for the Australian context now. And also I think the big issue here was we can't progress shared accountability without progressing or addressing the significant child poverty and inequity in this country, particularly around supporting material conditions that children and families need to thrive. So looking at what is a system-wide strategy and how do we really put that and elevate that to the top of the agenda. And finally, we've got shifting societies' perspectives. I think this was one of the most profound findings for us of this work, demonstrating that really digging into the deep mental models which underpin our current system and inform that is one of the greatest levers for transformational change, and that it's possible. And really that unless we're dealing with some of these underlying mental models and forces, we're not going to see the change that we want to see in outcomes. That no matter how much we focus on policies and practice change and resource flows, as important as they are for the long-term change to see all kids and families thrive, we really need to be leaning into this more invisible area around mental models. So some of the focus areas on this, we're looking at building capability generally around better understanding and engaging with mental models, and also starting to identify different interventions at different level, whether that's in a school, in a community service, or in a statewide strategy to start nudging those mental models towards what we know we need to be in the future state. And the other is really looking at the work had some interesting findings around looking at what are the core mental models that are driving other mental models, and really situated around equity, disadvantage, race and racism. And so I think it's an interesting finding there to really lean into the importance of coming together beyond the early years system and sector to work with others around influencing some of those broader mental models that shift our work in social justice more broadly. So that's a very quick take on some of those findings, and really encourage you to look at the work. Moving quickly, I guess we've looked at the what is it, what's it done, so what, and now it's the what next. The early years catalyst has come to the end of this phase. There've been a lot of really significant learnings, and I think using and embedding those learnings is really the first step that we see. Dan, can you shift to the next slide for me? I'll just quickly talk to those. So for us, this is the number one, I guess, importance. And there've been enormous learnings from this work and from trialling a field catalyst, from really thinking from a systems perspective lens. What it's told us, I guess, is that transformational change is possible, but there's no silver bullet. What it does require is many actors coming together, and beyond leadership, across the whole system, we need actors engaging in this, in many actions, working together in a deeply committed way. We need action across the different clusters that I spoke about, across all sort of levels as well, from an individual level to a community level to a sort of more macro level. We need to think about where we have agency and authority to influence, and from starting from that point. And also acknowledging that change is not, we're not talking about a revolution really here. What we're talking about is systems change happening in these small incremental nudges or shifts, and over long periods of time, and the consistency of work we need to be sort of driving that. Sequencing of actions, so looking at leverage points being interconnected, and looking at, do we have enablers and preconditions really strong before moving to other areas? Thinking about that. Thinking about how we tackle the big levers of change, which we often avoid, around relationships and connections, around power, and in particularly around deep mental models and society's attitudes. Finally, I can say, that time and patience part. So there's no election cycle that's going to see any of these key leverage points implemented. We are in this for the long haul. I think we've all been in this for the long haul, so it's not surprising. But one of those really important factors to situate ourselves in. We've got short-term opportunities, but this is sort of a long-term game. So in terms of what next, we're learning from these from the insights from the report. But the work has really helped us to build a shared understanding of the many systems with which families interact. It's helped us to see the system, to understand why we're not seeing the changes that we're all wanting to see. It's helped us to understand and not shy away from the complexity in that system, and seeing ourselves and our role in that system and what that means. And it's opened up different understandings of the challenges and also the pathways forward to solutions. It's been fantastic to see the energy across the whole field, really, in developing this work, in particularly frontline workers, where they feel like a really great thirst for engaging with this, from thinking from a systems perspective, from challenging the dominant ways of thinking and really stepping into how do we act and think differently, which was really exciting. It's been great to see the work start to be used and taken up in different fields and spheres, and particularly, I think, a greater focus on mental models, which, as we said, is really fundamental. But it's still very much a beginning, with the Catalyst goal to support the field to disrupt and transform Australia's early years system so that it supports all young children and families to thrive. So we're very much at the beginning of this process, but the context also is completely different now to what it was 5 years ago. And we think that different vehicles and different partnerships, new and existing, are really needed to drive this next part forward. Having started at a time when COVID hit and going through COVID, in seeing a shift in government and an enormous change in government appetite for early childhood reform and the opportunities that presented, as well as the demands on the sector. We've seen the sector evolve enormously in the last 5 years, with really new, big and diverse voices coming to the fore. We've got vehicles like the Investment Dialogue for Australia's Children. We've got campaigns like Thrive by 5. It's a very different space. So the leadership decided that the early years catalyst emerged from the field, and at the end of this phase, it's time to return to the field, to take up and embed the learnings, but also to continue progress on disrupting and transforming the transforming agenda. Thanks, Diana. I'm looking forward to hearing from the panel on their reflections.
Sorry. There we go. Thank you very much, Dan and Emma, for giving us that quick canter through what's a really amazing body of work. You'll see in the chat a link to the Early Years Catalyst website where you'll be able to find all of these documents and dig into that really in-depth work that you'll see in there. Now, when we started planning for this webinar, we realised that we didn't just want to showcase and spotlight the body of work, as important as that is. We really wanted to be able to share some of the learnings, not about the content, but about the process. And to do that, we brought the band back together. We have an amazing panel for you, comprising our two co-chairs, Penny Dakin and Jane Hunt, and Suzie Riddell of SVA, who is representing our backbone team. Penny Dakin is Executive Director of Communities at Minderoo now, but for most of the life of the Catalyst, she was CEO of ARACY. And similarly, Jane, who among the many hats she is currently wearing, an associate at Orange Compass, but is here calling back to her previous role as CEO of the Front Project. And they're here to spill the tea on everything we learned during this collaboration. Now, we'll be collecting questions from the chat and the Q&A as we go along, so please pop in any questions that you've got for the panel in there, and some of you are already doing that, so thank you. But I will ask a question to kick us off, team. Penny, Jane, Suzie, out of all that good work, that body of work that the Catalyst has done, what have you found most valuable as you've gone forward? What's informing your thinking about better outcomes in the early years in the work that you're doing now? You're all being polite. I'm going to go to Jane first.
I knew you'd do that, Diana. And hello, everyone. It's wonderful to join you all. There are a number of things that are informing my thinking. I think one of the most important things that the work of the Catalyst did was to work directly with the service system. So at one point, there were over 400 services who work with families and children, and getting their really unique perspectives on both their experience of the service system and how it enables and constrains the work, but also the experiences of families and children. And I will never forget some of the stories that families shared around children not getting help in a timely manner and them timing out of systems so that their children didn't get the help that enabled, set them up for the future. I think one of the things that I've experienced in sharing the work on the perspectives of services is some people like to argue with it and say, actually, that's not evidence. Evidence looks like research, or it looks like other things. And I think for me, I just want to underscore how important a variety of sources of evidence are, and the very experiences of those who are in the services and families and children are absolutely critical for us both to understand what's happening, but able to make changes. in the service system. And it's just one thing that when I'm talking to people about it and they start to argue with it, I ask them to share or step into those experiences that have been incredibly generously shared with the Catalyst. So that's to kick us off, Diana.
Suzie, what would you add to that? Oh, Penny, you go.
Yeah, sorry. So all too polite. I think, given the shift and changing role that I've gone on since the Catalyst work came to an end, I think one of the really interesting perspectives is what about the establishment of a thing like the Catalyst. The Catalyst wasn't an entity, wasn't an independent organisation. It was something that came together as a collaboration across the field with multiple voices coming through, a very interesting and diverse leadership table with a backbone embedded in an existing organisation. And it was built, I think one of the really early quotes that we threw around when we were talking about the Catalyst was that they were built for change, not to last. And I think what's been really fantastic, and one of the things that I guess I'm taking forward, is that it doesn't always look like a new entity. It doesn't always look like a new piece of work that's established by one organisation on their own. In fact, actually the mechanisms that are at our disposal to drive reform and to do change and to push towards the accountabilities that Emma spoke about actually can look like a variety of things, and they also don't have to last forever. They don't have to be the thing that keeps going after the purpose has been met. They can actually end, they can sunset. And when you do that and you do it well, it's a very, very powerful thing to throw into an ecosystem. And I think that's one of the things that I'm certainly thinking about as I look at the place where we're at the moment, and how we need to be agile in our responses going forward.
Thanks, Penny and Jane. And hello, friends. I saw dozens of people's names jumping up that list who I know. So wonderful to see the interest in this and how many people across Australia are engaged. I really liked the references that both Jane and Penny made to how the work was done and the way in which insights and evidence were gathered. I refer to the content that was produced all the time in the work that we're doing in early childhood development and in other adjacent areas at SVA. And whilst it was at times excruciating, getting to the point of high quality outputs that can be shared with people who weren't in the room, who weren't at the summit, who are new into the field, who have been operating in the field at the front line and have come up and looking at the system level, to have all of these things articulated in such a thoughtful way with so many different outputs, I think is an incredible gift of the Catalyst. And some things age really fast and you look at them and think, that's not the latest list of reform things, because there's also been A, B and C, and other things will last a lot longer because they move much more slowly. And I'll finish on that for this question. The one that has sat with me most is the mental models work, because it was pretty gut-wrenching to see what the mental models of many people living in Australia still are around children, around childhood, the role of family, the role of governments, about disadvantage and equity. And it's not the layer that SVA operates at very often, and it deeply drives outcomes. It drives decision making about policy, it drives funding flows, it drives access, it drives quality, and we ignore it at our peril. So I think that for me, given the work that we're often involved in, is going to have the most lasting impact.
Thank you, Suzie. And yes, I would agree. If we have a think about the model, the waters of system change, which is one of the things that we often referred back to in the work of the Catalyst, that's right down there at the difficult pointy end of the work that we're doing. So we're getting some questions coming through, and I think from that, let's lead on to in terms of the learning about collaboration that we've gone through in the Catalyst. How would you recommend not-for-profits cooperate while avoiding competition for funding?
I'm sorry, I shouldn't laugh. That's very hard. That's very hard. I'm happy to jump in on that one. I don't think we did this particularly well. I think there was a lot of discussion up front about where should the funding flow and how would we manage it, and it was hard. It's tense. In the real world, people need to be paid for their time and their effort, and I don't know that we really did that in a way that most people walked away thinking it was fair. We were really challenged by a mismatch of trying to do something that generally the literature would agree needs to be very adaptive and quite long term, which is to be a field catalyst, in a box that was quite short term, originally a year and a half, and with some of the funding being not very flexible. So we had to say in advance, this is exactly what we're going to deliver with the funding. And we didn't know in advance exactly what we were going to do. So that kind of co-opetition, we need to collaborate, but we're also competing, was a real feature of the early years catalyst. And I think if you were to do it differently, getting really aligned purpose about why are we all here, what are we trying to do, and then taking it down into, and then how will that be governed? What are the structures that would support that? And then how do you get the right funding flows to ensure that it isn't as competitive as it might otherwise be? The good news is overall in early childhood development, there's lots more money than there used to be, both from philanthropic donors who are seeing the window of opportunity to influence for very large scale change, and from governments. So hopefully it doesn't feel quite as resource constrained as it might have in the past. Penny, Jane, you're both nodding vigorously, but I imagine you have a slightly different take on this competition piece.
Different but the same, I think, Suzie. I think you're right. I think your reflection that we didn't do it as well as we could have is accurate. I don't deny that. I think we didn't really anticipate just how ahead of its time the catalyst was. Like, I think there are similar mechanisms that existed in other sectors and internationally, but this was really the first time in Australia that we tried to do this type of thing for this particular piece of work. I think we were a little, I won't call us naive because we're not, but possibly naive in how we thought about that, the complexity of that collaboration and how hard it would be. I think the other thing to throw into the mix here is just a reminder that we set this up during COVID, or we started it just before COVID. So the early work of collaboration, that's all about relationships and all about getting on the same page and finding shared purpose and shared values and all of that stuff that we know is really fundamental to good collaboration. We did over Zoom with half of our group locked in the trenches in Melbourne, the other half of us potentially locked in our homes and working with the complexity of that environment, homeschooling, all of it. So I agree that we probably didn't do it as well as we should, but I think we also, I want to give us a break at the same time and say that we actually did remarkable work and remarkable collaboration given the extraordinary circumstances that the catalyst was set up in.
Yeah, I think just really it's a building on what Suzie and Penny have talked about and highlighting a couple of things. One of the things that did become incredibly important was the funding piece. And I feel like philanthropy is absolutely embracing the setting up of more collaborative work. And what we discovered in that is the funding needed to be flexible enough so that we could respond to the changing conditions in our ecosystem. So when we got a new government and the early years strategy was embarked on, it meant then that we could change some of the focus of our work to feed all that really strong evidence base in. So we had to have that relationship with our funders, which we did, to be able to say to them, okay, we've got to change some of the activities and milestones. And really what that highlighted for us was strong accountability, but also the transparency, so that there were feedback loops back to our funders around the challenges and the things that we needed to do to iterate. And just on the collaborative piece, it's always a challenge because the water we're swimming in nudges us to behave in a particular way, which is, at times really competitive because what we've internalized is a scarcity model. And in many ways, what the early years catalyst was trying to do was expand our way of working that wasn't rooted in scarcity. And at times I felt, did that in a way that was very generative. So there was an absolutely terrific sense-making session one of our first sessions post-COVID, where what we experienced was people bringing their multiple perspectives in and building a future state for the early years system that was genuinely generative and incredibly important. One of the things we learned, though, was that sometimes it's hard when you're doing collaborative work because you tend to go automatically to the known deep experts to form your leadership table, to form your collaboration. And I think one of the things that we would probably do differently or think about differently next time is actually think about not just the work those deep experts do, but what role do they take up in the system. So they were often the people that took up a stabilizing role in the system. They were running services, they were seeing families and children. That was incredibly important. They're often not necessarily the innovators. And so next time I think we would look to get more diversity of roles in that leadership system, because what we were asking leadership table, because what we were asking people to do was step outside of the role that they inhabited, you know, all the time in their organizations. And that's hard for anyone to do without being super intentional and equipping people to do that. And then one last point, Diana, was one of the things I felt was really important to our collaboration early is we went on a journey of learning together. So we literally all went to system school. We learned about the concepts that we were applying. We learned from each other about our experiences. And I feel like that's an incredibly important phase. And it's a phase, a friend of mine uses this analogy, it's slightly kind of violent, but what she says is you've got to do that in peacetime, because when war breaks out, you need your trust and relationships in place in order to be able to act. And I feel like that it's important to know what stage you are in your collaboration and that you've got those conditions in place around learning together, trust and relationships.
Beautifully said, and I'm going to jump in before Diana asks the next question, because I just want to point out how astonishing it is that we didn't spend the entire time just talking and learning and getting to know each other, because it would have been quite tempting to spend all the available time and resources on that. So to have done what you just described, Jane, and produce a whole lot of things that are of hopefully great value and quite pragmatic to lots of different actors is really impressive. I'm very proud of the work that many people contributed to, and the work that the leadership table and the backbone team did to make that happen.
And just building on that, since we're building on, I think the other, going to Jane's point about the learning together and the fact that we all rocked up to system school, I think it was 2 or 3 hours a week for 6 weeks online. But the power of that is not only did we learn together as a collective, but as people have taken on different roles in the system now over the last 4.5 years that we've been doing this, that power of knowledge and common learning and understanding has actually been disseminated much more broadly within the whole ecosystem as well. So the catalyst learned, the teams that we were working with at the time learned, and then that knowledge has just been further sent out on waves through the system. And I don't think we can overemphasize how powerful that is going to be, not only today but going into the future as well.
Fantastic. Penny, you've just answered the next question, which was around how do we keep the learnings of the catalyst at the top of the to-do list without a collaborative partnership driving it forward. And it's because all of us who've been involved in this work have taken those learnings, and whatever role we're in at the moment, and all 3 of you guys have either changed or are changing roles, that we see the ways in which you've taken this work with you and the ways in which new actors are stepping into these spaces and taking forward the work.
I think that's true, Diana, and I think on top of that, I think the power of the catalyst and reflecting again on what Jane said about the 400 odd stakeholders who were deeply engaged with the process from the very beginning. Many of them, it's not just us who are doing different and new roles, many of them have taken on different roles in the system as well. They all didn't come on the learning journey with us, but they all were part of the process. And the process, one of the things that I think that the Catalyst can be really proud of is the quality of the process that was undertaken in order to get to these really extensive suite of deliverables that Emma and Dan showcased. and we know we have actual live living examples that people are using those processes themselves now in the work that they're doing. You know, many of them in place-based initiatives around the country who are following very similar processes to do their own systems mapping with a local context. So I think that shared commitment to learning, to good process, you know, for better or worse, to good governance as well. You know, I think some of the governance we did really well. Some of it, as Suzie said, we didn't get perfect. But those things that have been widely disseminated across a very large number of stakeholders will live forward beyond just the life of the catalyst.
Well, you're all still here. You're here today, so clearly the relationships are holding up. Now, there are so many questions to choose from here, but I'm going to pull out this side chat we've got going on here, which is around how we can, and when we say we, I'm looking at you, Penny Dakin, as a funder these days. How can funders support some of these different governance approaches? How can we disrupt those power structures, and how can we encourage more joint proposals that where communities are an active stakeholder in the proposal?
Such a good question, Diana. I think I'll take a step back, and I'll talk a bit about the journey that I think Australian philanthropy is on at the moment. I think as a whole, Australian philanthropy is really taking a good look at itself and a look at actually answering those very questions themselves. I don't think that every philanthropy has got all the answers to that at the moment, but I think it's very exciting that we're starting to have the conversations. So, you know, you've probably heard, everyone's heard, you know, thrown about trust-based philanthropy, pay what it takes, you know, all of these concepts that are becoming a greater and greater part of the vocabulary of Australian philanthropy. And I know lots of philanthropies that are having those conversations internally at the moment. We're having at Minderoo one of those conversations internally at the moment. What does it look like for us to not only say those things, but actually to live them at a very practical level? That's going to look different in every context. And I don't feel like I'm talking out of school to say, certainly for us at Minderoo, we know that that's going to take some changes within us as an organisation as we try and figure out, you know, how you balance that with your own internal accountabilities and the need for, you know, legal and good partnership practice and all of those things. It's a journey. It's a relatively new journey for many of the Australian philanthropies, and I know I just asked the sector to go with us on the ride for that, and to as we might push you to be more innovative in your practice. I think the onus is actually on the sector to push back on philanthropy as well, and to urge us and encourage us to be more innovative in our practice as well. We're getting there. We're putting in place the mechanisms to enable it, but you know, it's a beginning, maybe a middle. It's certainly not an end state that we're at the moment.
Jane and Suzie, do you have anything that you'd like to add to that?
Okay. I think it's exciting that people are trying to ask these big questions, and we have, I think, some things that are really difficult to change. For example, a lot of philanthropists in Australia require a deductible gift recipient entity to receive their dollars. So you can't easily set up a new entity to run a new collaboration or kind of meet the requirements of a lot of different donors. So there's some things that are pretty technical, but it's exciting that there are conversations about this. I hope that people can be expansive in their connecting of the dots around the lessons learned. These are not just lessons learned for early childhood development. They could apply in a lot of different contexts, and equally they're probably experiments that are being run in other contexts that we may not be part of that could apply to us. And sometimes it's the philanthropists who have a really good bird's eye view to be able to see some of that and share the knowledge and the lessons, which is a really valuable role for philanthropists to play. And I continue to think that the more people think about philanthropy as being able to try things out, test and learn, go at something for longer than a political cycle might allow politicians to go out, like all those things are great roles for philanthropy.
Yeah, I would agree with that as well. And I think just something to add, I've had conversations with philanthropists where they've been worried about evaluating or understanding the impact of collaborative work. and have a strong desire for really solid metrics, like how many people are involved and all that kind of thing, when actually what you're really measuring is the depth of relationships, the trust that happens, the shift around power. And there are resources out there, rubrics that actually capture those evolutions in collaborative work. So I think sometimes it's about also looking for what other measures are appropriate for this kind of collaborative work.
There you go. Now it's your turn, Jane, to answer the question that I had next, which was around measuring that shared accountability. I'll answer this one quickly. The webinar will absolutely be available after today. Give us a few days to get it up onto the website, and our partners will be sharing it as well. And any questions that we don't get to today, we will be seeking, we'll do our best to answer them and put them up with the website as well. Now, the mental models has caught the imagination of some folk in the chat. So what's the path forward on changing these deep attitudes? There's a link to the work, some of the work that ARACY and the Thriving Queensland Kids Partnership are doing in the chat. But what else? What else have we got that you guys are aware of in the system?
I will share that we underestimate this work at our peril, and thinking that anything can just happen, either by through a policy change or a change in funding flow, or change in practice, without understanding how much the mental mindsets and models are driving things to be the way that they are. One of the things that we have found interesting that's informing our work is around testing messages with the broader Australian public where there needs to be political will to make a change. And the language that we are testing and hearing back is really informed by the mental models work. And as an example, if you can find the language that resonates with more people in Australia for a change that would be really positive for young children and families, especially those experiencing disadvantage, we want to do our best to equip our leaders and our really influential people to be using that language to influence the broader public opinion, and not just the decision makers in the public service who might be making changes. So that's an example, but there are deep experts who understand about what it takes to shift mindsets and mental models. And Jane, while we talked about the diversity of different experiences and roles around the leadership table, I think diversity of different tools and approaches to how to enact systems change is also one of our learnings. That there are folks who are phenomenally sophisticated at engaging with the policy engines, like productivity commissions and the early years strategy development and the Royal Commission. That's a very different skill set than the geniuses who developed Bluey, which is role modeling positive parenting, and then it takes a village to raise a child and all sorts of other things. And there's many, many other different tools and approaches that are important. So probably just emphasising what Jane said earlier about having people who've all got similar kinds of roles and also similar kinds of toolkits is limiting our ability to affect change.
Yeah, I agree, Suzie. I feel like for most of us, and Penny, you chip in, that this feels like the really core fundamental piece of work that needs to be built on and taken forward. And your comment about having people who are real specialists in that area working on initiatives, I think is absolutely right. I too found some of the mental models quite heartbreaking and actually challenging, because you kind of live in a bubble and you think everybody might have a similar view to you, and you find they don't. So yes, it reinforces really seeking to understand those models that are being held and the way they are driving system responses, the way families and children engage with services and with each other, and the way government develops policy. But Penny, I know you've got some thoughts in this area.
Yeah, I certainly do, Jane. And I just sort of caveat my response, I guess, with a content warning, because I too found the mental models deeply challenging, and very much so on a personal basis. And one of the mental models that came through our work was that kids with disability are just not as cute as other kids. And as a person with a disability, like, I personally found that incredibly challenging to read on a piece of paper, that it was significant enough of a mental model that it made it to the report, so enough people actually came up with that sort of belief or mindset that it featured. I guess the way we've gone about taking this forward learning at Minderoo, we've obviously as a foundation gone through a really big process over the last 12 months of really defining our strategy and the best actions that we can take in order to be able to drive towards better outcomes for kids. Mental models are a core part of that. We've identified it as being sort of almost like a foundational piece that all of the work that my team at Minderoo through the community's focus area are going to be doing around early childhood are actually deeply embedded around this layer of shifting mental models first. I think there's some more deeper research that needs to be done and some better understanding of the segmentation of some of these mental models. But I also think there's work to be doing around trying to come up with better messages. And I think Suzie is 100% right that we can't actually just trust ourselves as the early years sector to keep doing this type of work. Someone said to me a few years ago, if someone can sell Coca-Cola, you can actually convince people to do anything, because it's so terribly, terribly bad for you and full of all sorts of things. But if people can actually convince us, that that's a good idea and make our behaviour change, then we can convince people of pretty much anything. So I think that if you're using the right expertise, so that's certainly a priority that we've identified at Minderoo, and we're hoping to do some work in this area over the next 4 or 5 years.
As it happens, we have a question around children with disability, which is this deep work that we've done at looking at the connections between those 10 identified systems that children and families engage in the early years, and those areas and levers of change. How do we feel that this research and action can help inform the development of foundational supports? So this one is the work in action. Does anyone want to jump in on that?
Well, I'm happy to share that I think this is an area where lots of people who are getting together who are thoughtful about early childhood development recognise the opportunity to incorporate basically the big opportunity about foundational supports into the thinking about early childhood development, and that we may not have all of the right people in the rooms having those conversations about what's possible, including quite specifically people with disability, and in this case children and young people with disability. But the principles that have been discussed in some of the forums that I've been in about meeting families where they're at in places where they like to go, understanding that this is beyond a one-on-one therapy model, and that foundational supports are as much about incorporating things in a social environment where children are at the centre, in settings where they feel safe and have the ability to continue to develop and thrive, is really important. My impression is that this is quite a difficult design challenge about how does this not get parked off to the side, seen as a discrete system that gets its own funding for a little while, that gets punted between different agencies and possibly different levels of government. So embedding it somewhere so that it has a legacy is quite important. And then just to name one of the other challenges is around workforce. And the workforce incorporates multiple different professional tracks and different professional identities who don't all describe things in the same way or have the same pathway to kind of being in front of a child or in front of groups of children. So you can hear I'm definitely not an expert on this, but the kind of early childhood development reform agenda is certainly very, very alive to how does foundational supports sit really closely with early years and early learning, and not something that's seen as, well, that's an NDIS type thing that goes over there with different types of humans thinking about it.
Yeah. I think that's really powerful, Suzie, and I think I'm seeing similar things in the ecosystem. I'm seeing similar faces in conversations around early childhood development, and the development of the foundational supports. I think we were looking through the list earlier, and there are a lot of our government colleagues who are online today, and we're grateful that you've come along to reflect and be part of this reflection with us. We know that many of you are actually in the heat of doing this work at the moment, and I found it really refreshing. Actually, it seems like there's lots of the learnings that have come out of the Catalyst that are actually being applied to that foundational supports development. We know that big national mechanisms like the Centre for Policy Development's Early Childhood Development Council are actually cross-populating their findings from the Catalyst, their own findings, and the work that's happening for foundational supports. It feels a bit to me like, and I'm loath to say this, but it feels a little bit like a new era of different types of collaboration and sharing of learnings in ways that we probably haven't quite done as well in the past. I'm hopeful. I'm always hopeful that that's where we're at now.
Yeah, I'm hopeful too. I just wanted to add something. One of the things that the Catalyst showed was the multiplicity of systems that children and families intersect with, and they are the ones who bear the integration. They are the ones navigating all those multiple systems for their children. And I feel we need to shift some of that burden so that the systems itself are designed around integration in order to serve families and children. I can't tell you how many times a parent takes up that role under extreme, under a lot of pressure. And so part of the thinking around this is, what accountability do we have? What feedback loops and mechanisms do we have for children and families to say, this is our experience and this is how we need you to help shift these systems in order to actually meet our needs?
Terrific. Okay, we've got 5 minutes left and someone has given you an absolute doozy to finish off on. What change would you realistically like to see or expect to see within the early years sector in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years as a result of the ripples that this work has put out through the ecosystem? Suzie, you can go first.
Sure. I would like us to look back in the rearview mirror and remember this as the birth of the Medicare equivalent of early childhood development, when politicians were brave, when people got their acts together and said, this is for all children, everyone gets to participate. Some kids need more than others, and that's a good thing. And we're going to do what it takes to deliver that. And we won't be able to do it all at once, and we won't get it right. But imagine if that was the way it was described, as a totally transformative moment in time when we began a new early childhood development system rather than a childcare system for female workforce participation that was disconnected from all other parts of childhood development.
I think that's an astounding vision, Suzie. I think if I was trying to be hopeful, you've brought me on a hope journey. I think my reflections are probably a little bit more internally within the system. I can't beat your vision, to be quite honest, so I'm not going to try. What I also hope to see is that we as a sector, the players, no matter what roles we're playing in the ecosystem, whether it be stabilisers, as Jane described earlier, or dissonant voices that actually shift and press for more change. I'd like that one of the benefits that the Catalyst brings is that we actually do that in better ways, and we do it in a much more joined up collaborative way. We take the learning of complex collaboration and some of the things that we've shared today, and we actually apply it in our interactions and the relationships that we have across the ecosystem. And we don't have to compete. We don't have to come at problems with a scarcity mindset. We can be effective collaborators. And in fact, actually, the power of what we'll achieve is going to be so much stronger if we are collaborating and doing this work together. So in 10 years' time, I guess what I'm hoping for is that if there's a glitch in this beautiful system that Suzie's described, that when we try to address it, we address it with all of this much more powerful, stronger relationship-based collaboration, and it doesn't take us decades and decades to fix things, because the collaborations are so strong, we're actually able to do it much faster.
Okay.
That sounds great too.
I was about to say, how are we going to top any of that? You guys are awesome. I think then I'll focus on children and families. That all of that is happening, and children and families are flourishing in Australia, and we genuinely value what children bring and offer us in our community, and that they are able to realise their potential. Yeah.
Fantastic. That is a journey of hope that we can all get on board. I'd like to say thank you to Dan and Emma for guiding us through that body of work that the Catalyst has produced in its lifetime. And I want to say a quick thank you to all the folk, far too many to list here, but the folk who have come and gone and contributed to the work of the Catalyst over the time that we've had together. Jeff, Bree, Chris, special shout out to the wonderful Sal Mounsey, who has shepherded it through at different stages, including this last phase of this last push of getting those final publications out. Do go and visit the website and dive into the incredible resources that you will find there. A big thank you to our panel for being so generous with your time and your wisdom and sharing all the learnings from this collaboration of ours, the content and the process. And thank you to everyone who has taken the time to join us this afternoon. I hope you found it useful, and I hope you will join us on this journey of hope